Tonight we have a special guest speaker. Many of you know Matt, or you know Allie, or you know some of his other kids. And Matt, how would you describe your work, Matt?
How would I describe my work?
Okay. I'll go up. You can take your mask off.
Okay.
That'd probably be clear.
How do I describe my work? I work in psychiatry, so I work at Prairie Care. I actually manage Prairie Care. Got it started in 2014. I used to work at Mayo Clinic in the inpatient hospital for mental health for kiddos, and so a lot of experience that way. And pastor has asked me to kind of come and talk about mental illness and specifically kind of depression and anxiety. It's something that I'd be very surprised if each and every one of you hasn't dealt with it in some form or fashion, whether it's a parent or an aunt or an uncle or yourself on some level, or will in your life at some point. And so really, it's meant to be educational, and ask a lot of questions. I heard this group is really rowdy and talks all the time, and so that'll be perfect. Actually, I heard the opposite, but so please feel free to ask questions. I think it's a topic that sometimes people are scared to talk about because they don't know what it'll do or what people will say or what will it bring, but I think it's an important one to get a little bit more education on, and that's my goal tonight. So really fire away with any questions you have, and yeah, we'll get started, I guess. So, perfect. I went through a little bit. I've worked in mental health for 19 years. Like I said, it was 12 years at Mayo Clinic, and then I went over to Prairie Care. I don't do as much like on the floor nursing with folks anymore. I do more of the managing piece of the folks who work there and that sort of thing, and making sure that the education and the content and things like that are where it should be and up to date and things like that. And we also have one in Mankato that I kind of oversee as well. Yeah, and so I've worked with it for a long time, so I don't know that it makes me an expert, but I have a lot of experiences, I guess. One of the things, if we go to the next one, and I think I moved that slide into a spot that I didn't want it, so why don't you go to the next one. So for mental health, it's a manual that kind of has a lot of diagnoses. They call it the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And so in the last one, there was a big category of anxiety, and they actually split anxiety into 3 separate categories. And so I'll talk a little bit about those. And there is some videos and things like that, and it'll be an overview. So if you have questions about a specific one, make sure you ask. Because as you might guess, psychiatry, there's a lot of information here, and so it's hard to go through all of it. But basically, they split it into 3 separate sections of anxiety disorders, which some of the common ones are separation anxiety, selective mutism, specific phobias, arachnophobia, scared of spiders or snakes or whatever it may be, social phobia, panic attacks, agoraphobia, and then generalized anxiety disorder. One of the other components that they split out from anxiety in the last one is obsessive compulsive disorders. So many of you have heard of OCD, OCPD, body dysmorphic disorder, hoarding, trichotillomania. Anybody know what that is? Yeah? Yeah, kind of pull out your hair. And then excoriation disorder is similar, but it's with skin. So just some of those things. And then this third one, which I was really happy to see them break out into its own category, because it's actually, and unfortunately, very common, but it's trauma and stressor-related disorders. So that includes reactive attachment disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, acute stress disorder, and adjustment disorder. Any questions? That's a really broad overview, but any questions about specific anxiety disorders? They all have certain criteria that need to be met in order for it to be diagnosed. And if we flip to that last slide, Dawn, if you don't mind, actually one before it that I goofed up. No, one more. There you go. You can see the lifetime prevalence of an anxiety disorder. So 25.1% of folks in this room, if we gauge this as statistically kind of normal, will have a diagnosable anxiety condition at some point in their life. Now, mental illness is a spectrum, right? Sometimes it's very light and you might only have it for a little while, and other times it's more in the severe category, which means you might suffer, or the person might suffer for a long time with it, sometimes their whole life. And that's down at 5.9%, which is still pretty significant. As you can see on the right hand of the slide, there is a difference in females and males. Females do tend to get anxiety disorders a little bit more frequently than males. But as far as ages and when it kind of starts and things like that, there's not really, there are statistically significant differences between non-Hispanic, whites, and other races as well. So flip forward, Don, and then, yep, perfect. So symptoms of anxiety, I don't think any of this is groundbreaking information, again, but just kind of put on a slide. But restlessness, feeling wound up or on edge, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating more than usual, irritability, muscle tension, difficult controlling the worry, you're always kind of thinking about it. And then sleep problems. It can be difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or restless. One of the hallmark signs we look for with anxiety specifically is the difficulty to fall asleep. Oftentimes it takes people quite a while to fall asleep because they are concerned or worried or nervous or anxious about whatever it might be that they are worried about. Go ahead and flip forward, Don. Obsessive compulsive symptoms, if we look at those different categories, right? Fear of contamination or dirt. It doesn't just have to be dirt, it can be really anything. It could be, for some, I mean, it really could be COVID. We've seen that before. Doubting and having trouble tolerating uncertainty. So flexibility is really difficult, or if something happens where it changes plans, it's very difficult for folks. Needing things orderly and symmetrical. Aggressive or horrific thoughts about losing control and harming yourself or others. And unwanted thoughts, including aggression or sexual or religious subjects. And so I don't know if any questions on any of these so far. It makes sense, right? Kind of. Okay. Trauma and stress-related disorders. So some statistics for you. For folks who are actually hospitalized on an inpatient unit, about 90% of them have had some form of what we call like an adverse childhood event or a traumatic event. And in the level of care that we have at Prairie Care, which is called a partial hospitalization, is so if you look at the spectrum of psychiatry and you have like on the very severe side or the most acute side is the inpatient hospital, right? And so you really look at safety and things like that at that point. You have that, and then you have therapy where you might go every week, every other week, and so there's a wide gap in there. Partial hospitalization program is kind of right in the middle there, and so you're trying to help folks not get hospitalized, but also if you are hospitalized and you're coming out before you get back into normal life or school or whatever, it's kind of that next step back, so to speak. And in that level of care, it's about 70 to 75% of people have experienced some sort of whether it's abuse, whether it's just a traumatic event, a grandparent dying, a parent dying, something like that has really affected their ability to kind of trust and hope or whatever it may be. But there's a high correlation between adverse childhood events and mental illness as a teenager or kid or an adult. So, other symptoms would be being easily startled or frightened, always being on guard for danger, self-destructive behavior like driving too fast, maybe alcohol or drug use, other risky things, getting into fights or something like that. Trouble sleeping is a common one for mental illness. Trouble concentrating, irritability, angry outbursts or aggressive behavior, and a hallmark is really this overwhelming guilt or shame, like it's somehow their fault when it's not. Go ahead, Don. There are many different treatments, and a lot of times we try to pick the treatment that works the best, right? Medication that works the best or the treatment that works the best. But there's different types of them. So cognitive therapy, and that really focuses on identifying thoughts, challenging, and then neutralizing unhelpful thoughts that are underlying on these anxiety disorders. Exposure therapy, anyone have a guess on what exposure therapy might be? Yeah? Oh, were you not raising your hand? I thought you were like, I know what that is. No? Okay. So exposure therapy sounds kind of cruel, actually, and it's really difficult at times, but it actually focuses on confronting the fear that is underlying in an anxiety disorder in order to help them engage in activities that they've been avoiding. So a lot of times, for example, when I worked on inpatient hospital, we had an 11-year-old eating disorder, and he was scared to death of food. And so we would actually do exposure therapy as part of his treatment, and we'd have him eat the foods that he was most scared of in order to kind of normalize it for him. And you can kind of equate that out into other aspects too, like if you are deathly afraid of spiders and you don't leave your house because you're scared a spider might get you, we might have you, slowly kind of expose yourself to spiders so that become more normal and not as afraid. Acceptance and commitment therapy. This is an intervention that uses acceptance and mindfulness strategies along with commitment and behavior change strategies to increase flexibility. I realize that's a little jargony now that I read it out loud. Sorry about that. Questions so far? No? All right. Also support groups, other stress management techniques, mindfulness, distraction, fidgets. You guys know what fidgets are, right? My kids have fidgets, like fidget spinners or those pop-it things. Yeah? What's that? Oh, no, all right. And then also a treatment is medication too, and there's a wide variety of medications. Some can be really helpful, some aren't so helpful, but sometimes you see some really positive changes with kiddos or adults who come in and have some medication, and then they're really able to. And I think that's the key with mental illness, right? Is we wouldn't think anything about it if you're going in and getting glasses. We wouldn't think anything about it if you were diagnosed as a diabetic. Getting help and getting treatment. And really mental illness is chemicals in your brain. There's brain scans that can show like the difference in bipolar or even depression or anxiety versus what would be considered like a normal scan. And so it's a medical condition, and I think we're making progress towards it. When I went into psychiatry in 2003, it was not as good or as more stigma too attached to it than there is now, so I think people are getting better with it, but it's still a really difficult topic for people to talk about, and so we're making progress, but it is a medical condition, and would you not go and get help if you needed contacts or eyeglasses, or would you not take insulin if you had diabetes? No, you would, of course you would, or get treatment if you had a form of cancer. Yeah, you would. But many people with mental illness avoid it because they're scared of what people will think of them, which is really unfortunate. Yeah.
Something I've noticed with a lot of adults, they're maybe struggling with alcohol dependence.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it seems, I've mentioned to some of them, you know, I think psych med would be a whole lot more helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, oh, no, I'd never take that. And then I say, well, you're self-medicating with alcohol and it's not working.
Yep.
And I think that one thing for teenagers to be aware of is they might seek, if their endorphins and all that aren't just right, they might be more susceptible to chemical abuse, and it'd be a whole lot smarter to talk to a doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a really good point, Pastor, and we actually have a track in our partial hospitalization program that deals with chemical use as well as mental illness, and that's a conversation we have on a routine basis is, hey, if you're putting these chemicals are competing for the same neural pathways and in your brain, and so it's really it's hard for us to get a good look at what is the medication even doing if you are, using alcohol or drugs, and a lot of times that's what led them is those feelings and the lack of serotonin or whatever in their brains, and so they use alcohol or drugs because it does affect, the brain in that way, except for it doesn't have the same kind of healing effects as, a medication that's, would. So it's a good point, Pastor, and it is pretty frequent, and it's really, sometimes it's hard a lot of times the mental illness kind of came first, and then the alcohol and drugs kind of came after that as kind of self-medication. Yep. As we move on to depressive disorders, again, there's a lot of different diagnoses that are under this category. And so if you look at this, 11.2% of us at some point in our life will have a diagnosable depressive disorder of some sort. Now again, like I said earlier, it's a spectrum, right? Sometimes it's severe and can be over the whole course of the life, and other times it's for a moment in time. And so it really depends on what that person is going through and what they've been through and how they're getting it treated too. So you can see again, similarly, 11.2%, there is a difference in males and females in terms of depression and how likely, I shouldn't say likely, but there's just a difference in percentage there. So, in prevalence, I guess is the right word. Go ahead, Don. So I mentioned this, but some of these you may have heard of. Major depressive disorder. Bipolar disorder is actually categorized under depressive disorder in the DSM-5. There's dysthymia, also known as persistent depressive disorder. Anybody know what postpartum depression is? Yeah? What is it? Yep, after having a baby. A huge life event, huge life change. Hormones are all messed up. It's pretty common. And then there's one called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, psychotic depression, seasonal affective disorder, which Minnesotans are more prone to have because of where we live in the world, less vitamin D, situational depression, atypical depression, and treatment-resistant depression. Any questions on any of those at all? What's the bottom one? Treatment-resistant. So about a third of depressive disorders are what we would call treatment resistant. They don't respond super well to traditional treatments, so like medication or CBT or ACT. And so sometimes we'll try other less common forms of treatment like TMS, transmagnetic stimulation, or ECT, or things like that in severe treatment-resistant depressive disorders. So I like to think of it as like, you know, sometimes when your computer's running slow and you have to shut it down or restart it, that's kind of what ECT is. You're kind of resetting the brain, so to speak, and there's a lot of evidence behind it. A new and kind of upcoming thing is what I said before is TMS. And so instead of resetting the whole computer, you're really focalizing the spot on the brain that they've kind of identified is difficult. And so it's a lot fewer side effects and typically much better handled. And so that's actually not available in kids yet, but we're hoping it will be soon. Actually, Dr. Wall and Mayo Clinic's kind of the cutting edge of it, and we're doing some of the first trials in the world. And this was quite a few years ago, but it's cool because it can be really, really helpful for those treatment-resistant folks. But yeah, good question. Any other questions? Sorry. What's the second one? Oh, second to last one. So atypical. So that one's, I actually looked this up when I was doing this again. So atypical is, it doesn't follow the same patterns as a normal depressive disorder. So you see some different symptoms that you wouldn't necessarily associate with it. You know, and that's saying something because there's so many different symptoms that you can have. For example, in bipolar, you can have like a manic phase where you are a lot of energy and things like that. So it's one where you've tried to narrow it down. It's not that common actually, but it's one where you've tried to narrow it down, but it doesn't fit any category very well, and so it has its own kind of category. If you look up at like WebMD or MayoClinic.com, they'll have a better description of it for you with like, because remember when I said before in that manual, it actually has criteria that each diagnosis has, and that would be able to tell you what the actual criteria are of it. So, good question. Good. And situational, I think that one makes some sense, right? Because everybody goes through situations. Maybe there's a breakup, maybe there's a divorce, maybe there's, you know, a death of a brother or sister or something like that. So there's also situational that is within like the last 4 weeks or within the last 3 months. That's much more time sensitive in terms of what that means. So good. Pastor, how long do I have? Oh, okay, perfect. We better get going then. So symptoms of depression, again, persistent sadness, kind of anxiety, kind of feeling an empty mood. Hopelessness is kind of a hallmark sign. What we call anhedonia, which is things that you used to really enjoy doing. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's band or choir, singing, or whatever. You don't enjoy doing it very much anymore. So that's a sign. Irritability, feelings of guilt, worthlessness or helplessness, loss of interest, that's anhedonia. Decreased energy or fatigue, and moving or talking more slowly. Go ahead. Some more symptoms, aches and pains. I think on this slide, you can read it for yourself, but the one point I do want to bring forward is a lot of times there's physical pain associated with mental illness, and it's real. And so sometimes you hear, like, I have this pain, and you might go to the doctor and they're like, I don't know, everything looks normal. It can be from mental illness, and so there is aches or pains, headaches, cramps, digestive problems without a clear physical cause, and it can be from mental illness. And so it's very real. But that's one point that I think is worth bringing up, because sometimes people feel like, what's wrong with me? Well, if you have some untreated depression or something like that, it could be that. So, Again, other treatments, some of these are similar to anxiety ones, but there's therapies, CBT, ACT, the acceptance and commitment, medications, and then we kind of talked about ECT and TMS a little bit already. So go ahead, Don. COVID, I think COVID has raised some very interesting studies and just in how it's affected everybody, pandemic. And so this is not groundbreaking information. Like if you asked me when I did the research for this, if you asked me like, hey Matt, what do you expect to find with regards to depressive and anxiety rates since COVID happened, this is pretty much what I would say. But the reviewed studies reported negative psychological effects, post-traumatic stress symptoms, confusion and anger were kind of the highlight ones. Stressors, there's longer quarantine duration, infection fears, frustration, boredom, infection fears, inadequate supplies, inadequate information, financial loss, and then the stigma of having COVID. I think that's gone down a little bit as so many of us have had it or had a family member with it, but in the beginning, people really felt like leprosy or something if I had COVID. I think there's some of the things we've seen a lot of in the pediatric side of things is the social isolation. And I think in some ways social media has been good for folks and we've seen some good out of it. We've also seen it go to the negative. And you know, apps like Snapchat and those sorts of things, Instagram, if used too much or that's a focus, we've seen almost like addictive qualities to it as well. And so, again, there can be some good from it, but it can also go to the way negative. And if that's your only source of kind of social bonding, so to speak, or social even situations is through a screen, it really kind of, it's not the same as talking to someone face to face, right? That makes sense. And you lose a lot of context and people just are meaner kind of over screens too. So you gotta be careful for that. But things you can do, we're gonna watch a quick video, but be nice to others and yourself, try to be active, exercise, set realistic goals for yourself. Spend time with other people, confide in a trusted friend, relative. Try not to isolate yourself. I think that's a big one. Expect your mood to improve gradually, not immediately. I think so many of us are like, okay, I tried this and it didn't work immediately. Well, sometimes it takes a little while. Practice, you know. And then continue to educate yourself about depression and anxiety and learn more about it and what you can do. So, if we're able to get the video going now. Yeah, yes. You might have to escape out of it and then drag it over.
Nobody likes you. No one notices when you're in the room.
You're a mistake.
You're useless. You're not even green.
You look rotten. Are you really even alive?
I like you the way you are. Seeing you blossom makes me happy.
You're making a difference in the world.
You are beautiful.
I brought them here to see the plant. I was like, a plant is getting bullied. Like, it's not normal.
I think it's an excellent project. To have something tangible that they can actually physically be a part of is, I think, going to be very powerful.
As the weeks passed, I started noticing that the one that was being bullied started kind of to droop.
while the plant that was being complimented, it was flourishing and beautiful.
It's raised the profile massively of different forms of bullying and the effects that bullying can have on people.
If it affects a plant, it can definitely affect other people.
So just a little video about kind of the effects words can have. Go ahead and go to the next one if you want. So empathy and hope, I think, are two big things that we want to make sure that we have, not only for ourselves but for other people. What is empathy? This one I'll make you guys answer, someone answer. Anyone? What's empathy mean? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah, that's a very good way, trying to put yourself in another person's shoes and feel what they're feeling. Yep, very good, very good. So we can play this one now if you want.
If it's burning, you're doing it right. Work those shoulders, baby.
They all want the name. The game got us running through these veins. Make way.
Empathy is a choice, an opportunity to put yourself in someone else's situation, to view the world through the lens of someone else's circumstances.
Empathy is the ability to think about what someone else is going through, imagining yourself in that place. Empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another.
Empathy is being there for people who are your closest friends or someone you don't even know.
Empathy takes work, it takes practice. Empathy requires each one of us to stop thinking only of ourselves and to start thinking of others.
In our world, everybody has a need for empathy, whether it is great or small.
Every day, in every school, students are made fun of, outcasted, looked down upon, and made to feel worthless.
Life can be lonely at times. It's important to feel like someone has your back.
We judge people when we do not understand them.
People say sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you, as if that were true at all.
Empathy towards others encourages hope, encourages love, or encourages tolerance.
Respect people's feelings. Even if it doesn't mean anything to you, it could mean everything to them. Empathy shows the people that are hurting that someone cares and that they are not alone.
Instead of putting others in their place, put yourself in their place.
No prescription works like empathy can.
We must step out of our comfort zone and be the reason someone smiles today.
Empathy is like a wildfire. A simple spark can ignite a chain reaction of compassion.
Empathy can change the world, starting with just one person, and that one person could be you.
And so empathy and hope have been researched and are shown to be, that's my cue to go faster. Empathy and hope have been researched, and they're two key pieces that if people have, it's been shown that they have better what am I trying to say here, Matt? They have better chances, or they're shown to get through depression and anxiety and different mental illness quicker, not only quicker, but for longer periods of time than those who report that they don't have these things. And, in there it said, empathy is, putting yourself in another person's place and showing them love and compassion. And I can't help but think of, who can we think of who came into this world and showed all kinds of love, hope, and compassion to people who didn't necessarily think they deserved it, or for others who didn't think they deserved it. Anybody? Starts with a J. Jesus, yeah, exactly. So if we can kind of reflect some of what Jesus' teaching are in the form of empathy, boy, we can start something cool. So, all right. There's some other videos, and I have a PowerPoint, and I can actually give you my PowerPoint, and it has the links that are embedded in them. Feel free to look at them if you want. Go ahead. And the last piece that I want to talk about is, how do we talk about this? Because at some point in your life, if you haven't, you may run into this, but someone who, a friend, a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, who might suffer with depression or anxiety or some form of mental illness. And how do you talk to them? What if they're being unsafe? What if they tell you, I'm having thoughts of being unsafe? How do you talk to them, right? I think the toughest thing, and something, when I was your age, I wouldn't have known what to say. So to be honest with all of you, I would have probably said nothing, because I didn't want to make it worse, right? Or I didn't know what to say, or I don't know. And I think that's the one thing that we don't want to do. We don't have to say anything fancy. We don't have to say anything exactly right. We just have to say something like, boy, I have no idea what you're going through, but I care a lot about you, and is there some way I can be helpful? And if they are having thoughts of, safety as something that's, they're thinking of, or it's important that you tell someone else, even if they say, hey, I don't want you to say anything to anybody. It's very important that you do. I'll give you an example of a young lady who, she told one of her friends, and she said, don't tell anybody, but I'm having thoughts of wanting to hurt myself, kill myself, and but don't tell anybody. And luckily, she had a friend who did, called her mom, and she got her into the emergency room, and that particular kid was so grateful then after that friend had done that, even though initially that friend was really worried that they're going to be mad. So it's important that you do talk to them about it. It's important that if you're worried about someone's safety, that you talk to someone else about it too. So, and that can be, again, a parent, an uncle, an aunt, a coach, a pastor, teacher, mentor for confirmation mentor, and really anybody. So, I think, yeah, questions. I have, for mentors, I have copies of the slides as well as some questions to ask your small groups if you want. Feel free to get those. I can hand them out or whatever. But any questions, guys? Or gals? Yeah. Yeah.
And I can't help but think, some of these young adults might be wondering, well, gosh, I felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, maybe, and you mentioned some red flags here at the end, so when it comes to safety and we're worried about, someone hurting themselves, that's kind of a red flag to say, you know what,